All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the Business and Money Modeling Masterclass with Volition. I'm Karen Cornelson, and I'm the Manager of Marketing and Communications for CAST, and I'm also the manager of the Nelson Innovation Center. So before we get started, I just want to give you a quick update on some exciting things happening here at CAST. First off, we have the first ever Kootenai Pitch Competition taking place this Thursday at 7 p.m. Virtually. Basically, it's the Kootenai's version of Dragon's Den. So 4 local Kootenai entrepreneurs will pitch their business to a panel of judges made up of investors, local tech experts, and industry professionals. And we'll be coming to you from the Nelson Innovation Center. So get your free ticket at cast.com/KPC. I'll put it in the chat for you. I also want to just quickly tell you about a brand new program we just launched. It's called the Digital Economy Rapid Response and Resiliency Program, or DER3 for short. And basically, it's a no-cost, no-obligation program for any Kootenai business in any sector to get help in entering or expanding into the digital economy. So if you or someone you know needs help, please go to cast.com/DER3. I'll put that in the chat too. And again, it's free help for any businesses who need to build their online presence. I'll also put my email in the chat if you just want to get in touch with me directly. So without further ado, I'm really excited to introduce our presenter today, Chris Stairs. Chris Stairs has over 20 years of experience in strategic marketing and operational startups. He helps organizations position for market entry, push through financial hurdles, and build foundations to become best in field. A senior consultant with CanadaStartup.com, finance specialist for Volition Advisors, and entrepreneur in residence at SFU Venture Labs, Chris has supported ventures across a broad range of sectors. Prior to his work in the venture space, Chris began his career in sports marketing and tourism hospitality, working for such global brands as the NBA, Olympics, and the Vancouver Aquarium. Take it away, Chris. It's all you.
Thanks so much, Karen. Wow, that's far more than I deserve in terms of an introduction, but I really appreciate it. And also congratulations to you on this upcoming event. That's going to be really exciting for everybody. I can't wait to hear the outcomes for sure. So look, I'm going to just do a quick screen share, set up my presentation. Thanks again to everybody for joining us today. I really appreciate the support and for you to share some time. This presentation is on business and money modeling. Presented in partnership with Volition Advisors, working closely with CAST. The presentation is going to take about an hour and a half, and there'll be about an hour of core presentation and then another 30 minutes in Q&A. And I'm hoping, we've got the chat lines open, but I'm going to warn you, I'm not a very good multitasker. So I'm hoping you can save the questions to the end because I may not necessarily catch everything that's showing up on the chat screen. But hopefully this will seem fairly straightforward. And then if you do have any questions, we'll definitely have about 20 or 30 minutes to address them as we get to the end. So moving ahead, business and money modeling. Again, I'm going to just present a little bit about myself. As Karen said, I have a bit of a curious background, and I want to start off by, I'm going to make the assumption that most of you online today are in a situation not unlike I was about 10 years ago, in that you're involved in some sort of a startup situation, but you have very little to no experience when it comes to finance, especially startup financing and money modeling. And if that's the case, you're very much what I was like about 10 years ago. The irony is I'm by no means a finance guy. I'm certainly not a chartered accountant or CPA of any kind. My background, I do have an MBA, but ultimately the first 15 years of my career were much more as a sales and marketing specialist. And as Karen mentioned, I was involved in some brands, including the NBA and Olympics and FIFA, but really I knew very little about complex budgeting, startup finances, or anything around the ideas of developing what they call this pro forma, which is often a more sophisticated financial statement that you need to prepare for startups and certainly for due diligence with investors. So I really knew nothing about all that. And about 10 years ago, after my stint with the Olympics, I ended up getting involved in a technology startup, an event ticketing platform. And I was sort of jokingly the spreadsheet guy on the team. And so it was up to me to really kind of comprehensively work out the money model and ultimately develop a pro forma for investment. And I can tell you, I kind of struggled because I discovered there weren't a lot of resources available online or in terms of local workshops. And I started to realize, well, this is an area that I really want to focus on and try to assist others. And so I've essentially been self-taught over the last 10 years. And I can tell you, it's actually a relatively modest amount compared to some of my colleagues and serial entrepreneurs I know in town. But I can tell you that with my learnings over the year, I've been able to help raise close to 9 million directly and indirectly with any number of startups, including the one I was involved in, but others as well. So hopefully that gives me a little bit of street cred. Now, having said all that, there's something that I have learned as it relates to the startup space. And it's what I've discovered is there's an incredibly large number of really passionate people out there who come up with fantastic ideas and innovations all the time. And what I've kind of determined is that actually generating the ideas is a bit of the easy part. It's understanding how to monetize your innovation and take that idea and turn it into something that could be a sustainable operation that can earn you a profit over time. That's where things get a little bit more difficult. And people tend to shy away. And what I've discovered is that while there's a lot of fantastic programming being offered out there in all the various different accelerators across the province and lots of great content online, whether it's YouTube or otherwise, that really instruct you around the world of market validation. So the notions of coming up with a precise problem product thesis, interviewing some would-be customers, going through that customer discovery process, which sort of informs the creation of a minimum viable product that you can test in the market. Very little attention is actually paid to your financial viability. And what I always say is, at the moment you are struck with inspiration and that you have an idea around an innovation or a very simple business concept, you should be at the very same time that you're evaluating the market opportunity, you know, who might be selling and who you might be selling to and why. You also want to start to look at the numbers to your business. You know, how precisely am I going to charge a fee? How much is that fee going to look like? How often could I be charging that fee? And ultimately, is there a big enough market out there that I can find for people to buy this in volume? And so what I say in the simplest of terms is, while there's absolutely a lot of attention that needs to be focused around the research and the generation of some form of a minimum viable product that you can test in the market, at the very same time, you should be thinking a little bit about what your minimum viable financial plan should look like. So the MVP and what I refer to as your MVFP, and those two discovery processes should be happening at the same time. Now, having said all that, that may seem like common sense, but I'm going to just come out and address a white elephant in the room. And again, this is just from my experience working with entrepreneurs for the last 10 years, is that while all that may sound like common sense and seem pretty straightforward, there's a funny thing about human nature. My experience is that the greater majority of entrepreneurs I've worked with, and just people in life in general, tend to shy away from numbers, tend to not really go through that exercise of quantifying their effort. They love talking about the ideas, but they shy away from the numbers. And I think the reality is that notions of finance and going through the effort of taking an abstract idea and introducing the accountability that comes along with quantifying that and putting precise numbers to things, I think people find it intimidating, and I think ultimately it leads to a little bit of procrastination and avoidance. But what I'm going to tell you is that the happy truth is that the moment you really start going to the effort of applying numbers to your business model, you're going to discover it actually completely accelerates and helps you to navigate your path to success. The moment you begin to quantify your business in the form of a money model, it's the moment that things become a lot more real. You get a lot more clarity. And there starts to be a lot less second guessing around certain critical decisions that you may need to make relating to your operations model or your sales model. Things become a lot more refined. And for you as a CEO and founder, that's absolutely essential because it begins to bring more certainty as it relates to your strategic path and growth. And then most importantly, of course, there's really no chance that you're going to have any luck raising funds until you get your head wrapped around that money model. Now, I'm going to provide some sort of general tips over the course of this presentation. I'm going to start off by saying, if this really is new for a lot of you, if many of you are on that earlier stage of exploration, maybe it's your first startup, you're a first-time entrepreneur, and you've really never gone through the exercise of money modeling before, then just start simple and start in the rough. The analogy I quite often use is not unlike sketching out a portrait or a drawing, and I've done a little fine art in my time. You know, an artist very rarely dives into the detail right away. They always want to just sort of flesh out the composition in a very simple form in the beginning, and then slowly fill out the details over time. And so my message to you is that if money modeling and finance is an entirely new subject for you, and most especially the complexities of finance around a startup, just start real simple in the beginning. And go through the exercise of roughing out what I call your cocktail napkin numbers. And I say this quite literally because in my experience working with entrepreneurs, some of the most effective serial entrepreneurs that I've ever seen in action, especially when it comes to presenting to would-be investors, is they don't even jump into the slide presentation. They don't necessarily dive into this comprehensive 10, 12 tab, 5-year pro forma projection. Really, the most effective individuals who can sell their business and sell their money model can rough out the basic story on the back of the envelope or on a cocktail napkin in a noisy coffee lounge. It's only after you've gotten a basic sense of your numbers and you have some degree of confidence that, yeah, on the surface, these numbers make sense, that you're going to want to go to that extra step and really start to build out a more comprehensive pro forma. And what I'm going to be talking to you about today is really more about that cocktail napkin exercise. It's just to say, how do you get started in a rapid fire fashion of really understanding what your particular money model is going to look like depending on your business model. And I'm a real believer when it comes to this minimum viable financial plan, this MVFP. I'm a real believer in having a systematic, sequential approach. When you've got a bit more of a daunting, complex task ahead of you, the best way to tackle it is to break it down into bite-sized chunks. And I specifically encourage you to do it in a sequential fashion because, and in this particular case, I'm going to walk you through sort of the 7 major questions you need to ask about your business and your operating model. I'm going to tell you that what you want to do is you want to ask yourself these questions in precisely this order. Because you're going to discover that the answer to that first question is going to immediately begin to inform you as it relates to the most probable answer to the second and third question. And it keeps the exercise very simple for you. So this is your master checklist. And my goal for today is to kind of run through that full list and give you a bit of a lowdown on how this might apply to your particular business. And I'm going to start off with something real simple. And I know this may seem elementary. But step 1 in fleshing out your money model is simply to ask yourself, well, look, what is my business model? What am I? And usually it falls into one of 3 categories. There are others, but first and foremost, am I primarily a business-to-business provider? Am I a business-to-consumer provider, a larger volume e-commerce or retail play, for example? Or am I a marketplace model like Airbnb or Uber or StubHub? And just sort of stepping back for a second, saying, okay, well, I recognize I fall into one of those buckets is going to begin to help inform what your money model is going to look like. Because then the next question I'm going to ask you is, okay, fine, you kind of know what your business model is, but really what exactly is it that you're selling? And, my experience is that the product or service you sell, generally speaking, falls into one of these 6 categories. It may be something else. But again, try to sort of self-identify. Am I ultimately selling a physical product of some kind? And it might be a particularly complex, technical device like a drone. Or am I on a digital side? Am I digital software like MailChimp or something more complex and robust like Procore, which is a very sophisticated software platform for the construction management industry? Or am I digital services like Netflix or PayPal? Do I fall into one of those categories? Or we could scroll further down and say, look, I'm actually just a straight up retail play. I'm an e-commerce play. I have a very simple product that I'm trying to get out into the market in volume, whatever that might be. Or last but not least, again, am I a marketplace model? Not unlike Airbnb, Uber, and StubHub. And the reason why you want to ask yourself that question is because depending on which category you fall into, I'm going to say that the kind of business you are and the product or service that you sell pretty much is going to dictate how you're going to charge a fee. And that really is the starting point for your money model is how do you start a fee and what's your price point for a single transaction or client engagement? And again, they're going to vary. If it's a physical product, like selling a drone or an iPhone, generally speaking, it's a fixed one-time fee. If you sell in volume, there might be a bit of a negotiation involved, but usually it's a single transaction. If it's a more expensive product, there might be a payment schedule over time. If it's something like a car or certainly a house, you're engaging in some sort of a payment plan over time. But typically, it's a fixed one-time fee. On the other hand, if it's digital software or services, more often than not, you're going to be modeling out some sort of a subscription model where you're going to be charging a recurring fee over time. And it could be as frequently as every month. And it's sort of an auto pay program on a credit card, very much like MailChimp or Netflix. Or in the case of some more expensive, more sophisticated transactional software like Procore that I just described, it could be a negotiated annual license fee. And those annual fees are often negotiated over a 2, 3, 5-year contract. Now, let's switch gears and look at something like SAP, based here in Vancouver, a very sophisticated technology solutions company. That's yet again very different. Every single client that they're dealing with and servicing, it's usually a very complex solution where the scope is being negotiated, and it's quite different from one customer to the next. There's a negotiated scope of deliverables and a negotiated set of fees that could tie into hardware, software, and consulting services. And again, you need to step back and ask yourself, well, yeah, I kind of fall into that category. And the first startup I was involved in, that event ticketing platform, it was a combination of hardware, software, and ultimately physical deployment at a precise location. That was a very complex pricing model we had to sort out. One last example would be the marketplace model. And again, that sort of transaction fees, but often at both ends. And I'll use StubHub as an example again, my bias in the event ticketing industry, but StubHub is typically charging a modest transaction fee at both ends, both with the seller and the buyer. And between the two of them, it's usually 10 to 15%. And it amounts to about 25% of total gross value of that transaction. These are just examples, although I'm going to suggest to you that these are some of the more common examples you're going to run into. So again, when it comes to you and your startup, what I'm going to suggest is go through these questions. Ask yourself, what am I, and what is my business model, and what is it that I'm selling? And is there a typical revenue model or a way of charging a fee that I can recognize and relate to in the market? So that's step one of the 7-step process. Now, step 2 is you kind of know what you are and how you're charging a fee. The next really potentially tricky question you need to ask yourself is, okay, but how do I set a price? And it takes time to research, and it's a big part of your customer discovery when you're going out and speaking with your first set of pilot clients and foundation clients. But basically what you want to be mindful of is setting price is about recognizing that you're going to be up against 2 sets of pressures. There's going to be internal pressures that are going to require you to kind of drive that price upwards. And there's going to be external pressures that are putting a downward pressure on your price point. And you need to do a little bit of research on both those fronts before you can really settle in and fixate on a price. The downward pressures, no big surprise, but depending on what it is you're up to and the kind of market you're looking to pursue, you need to investigate your competition or alternative solutions that are out there in the market and kind of understand, well, what is my competition up to? Are they offering a similar solution to me? Ultimately, what's the quality of that product or service? And where do I compare? I mean, am I ultimately a bit more of a premium offer, or am I a bit more of an economic offer? Does that mean I have an opportunity to price a bit above or a bit below competition? And there's no perfect science to this, but you certainly need to kind of maybe set up a bit of a research matrix on your competition and start to kind of plot out where you may land in the scheme of things. You also, of course, need to be mindful of the fact that you're going to be up against what I call market sensitivity, or economists call it price sensitivity. There's a point at which you will hit a ceiling and you will be unable to charge any higher, because ultimately your market will push back and say, look, as much as your product and service may be compelling, you're charging at a price that goes beyond the value that I equate to what it is you're giving me. So you need to be mindful of those. Those are going to effectively drive the pressures that drive your price point down. But equally importantly, you absolutely need to do homework on what your cost structures are, both your fixed costs of operations, month to month, year to year, and your direct costs of sale for every single transaction that you engage in the market. And you have to make absolutely certain that when you set a price, that at the very least, you're covering those costs. Now, this is where I'm going to go back to that early, very elementary question that I started off with about, what are you as a business and what is it you're selling? Well, the reason why it's important to just step back for a second and say, okay, well, wait a minute, what am I exactly? Is because I can tell you after modeling multiple pro formas that what you are completely dictates the kind of cost structures you're going to be up against. And the good news is, the costing model for different businesses is usually very universal in nature. There's kind of paradigms. And investors know this as well. So as soon as you tell an investor that, I'm in the business of manufacturing and selling sophisticated device technology like a drone, immediately an investor is going to understand. And as you do some research, you're going to understand, well, there's sort of a preset model, operational model, and cost structure that goes along with that. In the case of physical product, right away, you're going to be dealing in the world of raw material acquisition, all the different components that go into the construction of a drone. And then you're going to be thinking about, okay, well, how do I warehouse that? And how much is that going to cost me? And then from that raw material warehouse, ultimately you need to arrange for those materials to arrive at a factory for manufacturing and assembly at some point in time. And then once they come off the assembly line, you have an inventory story that you need to manage. Inventory and warehousing, that's on the operations side. And then ultimately on the sales side, there's the whole physical process of selling and distributing the product, either through channel partners or directly to the end client. And when it's a physical product, sometimes these things break down. So you may also need to consider a post-sale maintenance program. Now that may seem very self-explanatory, but the reason why I'm drawing your attention to this is because, of course, that's completely different from a situation where, for example, you might be a self-serve SaaS, like MailChimp. Well, your cost structure is going to be very different. And the good news is, in the case of software, usually your startup costs are quite a bit lower. Quite often the story is about 3 or 4 or 5 developers getting together, locking themselves in a basement, living off ramen and Red Bull for 6 months, and they crank out that minimum viable product. And then they launch out on a sales and digital marketing campaign, and the whole thing is operating on the cloud. This is very much a virtual operation and a digitally based business. Well, just to kind of walk you through those 2 examples, you can sort of understand that your sales engine and your cost structures are very different. But it's important to recognize that, and it's important to do research on each of those individual costing components, because again, the answers to all that are going to directly inform what your minimum price point absolutely needs to be in order to cover your costs. Now, in the abstract, I'm sure and I hope that sort of makes a certain degree of sense. But at the end of the day, you're going to get down to a point where you say, Chris, look, that's great. I understand in theory how that works, but how do I actually settle in on a specific price that I know is viable? And here's where I'm going to get into item number 3. And I'm going to talk to you about what angel investors refer to as your unit economics. And basically, it's the foundation of your profit, and it's asking yourself, do you know precisely how much profit, on average, you make on any single sale or over the lifetime of a customer account? And the math is real simple. If you're selling a physical product, it's the price of that product less the direct material costs of sale. That might include a portion of labor to manufacture that particular unit, and maybe a bit of commission that goes along with the sale of that product. And you're left with your gross profit. With something like software, or a digital service like Netflix, gets a little bit trickier. Your gross profit calculation is really about trying to understand, well, what's the total lifetime value of a customer? Because of course, it's not a single payment. It's a series of payments over time. So you need to, when you're fleshing out your model, you need to think about, okay, what's going to be the minimum? Can I estimate, maybe looking at some comparable services that are out there, can I estimate what the minimum lifetime could be for one of my customers? And if I'm charging a certain fee every month, and maybe I'm estimating that they conservatively are going to be with me for about 18 months, what would be the total lifetime value of that client? And then you need to ask yourself, and it takes a little bit of research into the market and a little bit of experimentation with your sales and marketing engine, but start to get an idea of, well, how much is it actually costing me to land every one of those clients? And how long do I need to hold on to them in order to make sure that I'm making gross profit over time and over that 18-month horizon? Well, again, here's something I can share with you, and it takes a little bit to sort of discover where your sweet spot is with that price point. But what I can tell you, and this is some good news, I would encourage you to take this away as good news, is there are some minimum thresholds that you typically need to target for in order to ensure that you're going to be viable as a business over time. And again, it's the reason why the angel investors often refer to this as your unit economics, because they basically know that if you can't precisely guarantee a certain amount of gross margin per transaction, then it's very difficult for you to project that you're going to be a profitable company over time, generating multiple transactions at the same gross margin. And I'm going to just run you through this table quickly. What I can tell you is I don't really care what business you're in, whether you're selling product or service or software, or if you're in the e-commerce and retail play. If it turns out you're estimating that your gross margin per single sale is about 75% or more, then I'm going to say in terms of your unit economics, you're in a very strong position. You've got what I call a bit of a war chest, and you know that for each transaction you're generating a significant amount of net cash that you can apply towards your fixed costs of operations, and that you can use to self-fund the gradual growth of your business. But my experience is those percentages are fairly rare. And in actual fact, what you need to be mindful of is that depending on the business you're in, there's certain target gross margins you need to shoot for. And I'm going to say that if you're in the device, physical product, or software space, even retail, you usually want to be charging somewhere or trying to get somewhere between 50 and 75% as your gross margin for every single transaction. Now, there are some models where potentially you could go a little bit lower. The service sector, I've seen a lot of just straight up consultancies, accounting firms, legal firms can quite often survive on a 30 to 40% gross margin. Marketplace models can potentially be even lower, but my message to you is basically the lower you are with your gross margin, then you need to offset that loss in net cash and that loss in gross profit with the situation where you're running into high volumes of sales and you're effectively landing those sales very quickly. That's the only way you can offset a shortfall in gross margin. Absolutely critical. Now, the reason why this gross margin is especially critical for you as well, strategically, and I talk about the war chest, is because if you aren't securing these kind of gross margins, then it's going to be very difficult for you to be nimble strategically in certain situations. And I'll give you some examples. First and foremost, if you get into a situation where you may have a promising conversation with a customer and they want to purchase in volume, well, typically, anytime you get into a volume dialogue, your customer is going to be looking for discounts. And their discounts could be anywhere between 10, 15, and even 20%, hypothetically, depending on the situation. Well, you wouldn't be able to negotiate those kind of discounts if you don't have a 50, 60% gross margin. Another scenario where these gross margins are absolutely critical for you is if you start to realize that you're going to be heavily dependent on channel partners or distributors to get your product or service into the market. And we're going to run through some examples of what that might look like. But again, channel partners can easily be asking for anywhere between 15 to 30% of a cut on the average price of a transaction. Again, you would be unable to negotiate that kind of an arrangement with the channel partner unless you have generous margins to work with at the start. Last but not least, you need these kind of margins because, of course, what can happen is you may encounter fluctuations in your cost model. You may have fixed costs over time that may increase, like salaries certainly go up over time with inflation, or you may have a critical component in your device that suddenly fluctuates in price. If you're building something with aluminum, stainless steel, lithium, these are material costs that are fluctuating on the market all the time. You need to have margin to protect yourself. So I've spent a lot of time on unit economics, but really in the early days, unit economics are absolutely one of the most critical sort of thresholds and benchmarks that you need to strive for. And angel investors know this because it serves as the foundation of any future profit moving forward. And again, I'll just give you one example. Software as a service, I read a report recently that evaluated the 50 most successful SaaS companies in North America. And one of the many benchmarks they identified for success was the fact that over time, these companies needed to maintain a minimum gross margin on the lifetime value of the customers of about 65% as a minimum threshold, which, as you can see, sort of falls into that line item on the table. So those are the first three items. We've talked about understanding what you are and what you sell. Very much dictates how you charge. We've then talked a little bit about, okay, but what do I charge? How do I start to formulate an idea around my pricing points? And ultimately, what are the minimum gross margins that I need to make sure are built into that price structure in order to have the foundation for profit? Well, the next question you want to ask yourself is to say, okay, I kind of understand what a single transaction looks like for me from a financial perspective and a sales perspective. But now I need to start thinking about my growth engine. And how I replicate this time and again. And there's two dimensions you want to look at. The first one is as it relates to the potential for recurring revenue with a single customer. And another question you want to ask yourself when you get to this point in that sort of 7-question process is to say, is what I'm selling, whether product or service, something that has the opportunity of generating recurring revenue over time with the same single customer? Now, Netflix is a perfect example of what we call the auto-recurring situation, where once you've been sold to Netflix, or maybe it's Amazon Prime or Crave, a credit card is put down and then you end up in an auto payment cycle. And of course, in some instances, the customer even just sort of quietly forgets that they're actually paying $10 or $15 a month. And so from your perspective in terms of generating a predictable stream of revenue and ultimately a predictable stream of cash, that's one of the more ideal situations to land in. If it's not quite that scenario, a next one would be, well, am I in a regular replenishment situation? And a classic example is, that water cooler in the office building or the Canon photocopier. Those are both situations where certainly you're making some money off the sale or lease of the physical station, but really the money to be made is on the regular replenishment of the water jugs, or in the case of the Canon photocopier, the real money is made on the ink cartridges. So do you have the potential to pursue that kind of model with your product and service? And if you're not there yet, are there ways in which you could potentially sort of re-engineer your business model and your operating model to introduce something like that? A third model, if you can't necessarily guarantee that level of regular recurring revenue with your customers, can you at least be looking at a reoccurring situation? So angel investors often differentiate between automated recurring, like with Netflix, or at the very least reoccurring. And I'll give you a perfect example in my world is with my accountant. Every year around come springtime, there's usually a bill I need to pay when it comes time to processing my personal and my professional taxes. And, that fee varies from $50 to $100 every year, but basically my accountant can count on me and has for the last 10 years to be a source of business every June. So you want to ask yourself, is that a kind of cycle that you could potentially introduce, whether it's annual or might be seasonal or quarterly, what have you? If you can't do that, one last classic model is, say for example, with Tesla, you've sold the big product. But Tesla often enters into these ongoing maintenance programs where they're upgrading software and they may be, doing work and maintenance on the battery life, so forth and so on. So you want to be thinking as it relates to a single customer, how could I possibly be extending the lifetime value and finding ways of generating recurring revenue? If you don't fall into any of those categories, the last question you want to ask yourself, and I'm having a little bit of fun here with Tim Hortons, but are you, if you're none of those, are you simply a product that is highly sticky, what we say very sticky, where you just know the demand for the product is going to develop a bit of a habit to keep buying over and over again? And of course, the classic situation is the worker commuting to the office every day. They usually need that coffee fix and maybe if they got a sweet tooth, a donut. So is there, is that maybe a little bit more what your business model could be like, or could you get yourself to that situation? So that's as it relates to increasing the value of a single customer. The next question you want to ask, however, is, okay, I've walked through all of my pricing structure. I understand the profit that I can make off a single customer. And I understand that there's different ways in which I could maybe extend my relationship and my revenue opportunity with one customer. But the next question I need to ask myself is, okay, well, what am I doing to ensure I actually have a repeatable sales engine in place that is gradually driving more and more customers to my business and to my products? And in the early days, it's asking a couple of simple questions. First off, have you clearly identified a beachhead market in which there's a single precise persona that I can easily identify that is out there in high volume that I can sell to over and over again in a repeatable fashion? And most importantly, are they easily accessible? Are they people that I can reach, and are they people who are going to find out about me fairly quickly once I've begun to get active in the market? That's question number one. Question number two is asking yourself, do I have a repeatable sales engine behind all this that's been precisely engineered, a sales process that's been precisely engineered, that's systematic, and ultimately the real test that's trainable? So I can bring in digital marketing professionals and sales representatives, and through a series of documentation and precise step-by-step explanation, they can begin to slowly take over and drive this sales process. And it usually asks you questions about, do you have a consistent and predictable systematic way of driving impressions and traffic to your site? Number one. Number two, once traffic shows up on your site, do you have a way to begin to qualify that traffic and determine who could represent real leads or prospects for you? And then do you have a sales process, whether it's automated through a digital marketing engine or whether you're reliant on a human-centric team? Do you have a step-by-step precise sales process that brings a prospect through qualification to close? And then last but not least, when you've closed that customer, have you thought through what it takes precisely to guarantee customer success so that they're satisfied, feeling fulfilled, and the probability of you maintaining that customer over time is increased? Now, this dovetails into a totally different discussion, and I have some good news, and I would encourage you all to attend another session that CAST is hosting on December 8th at 12 o'clock, which really speaks to what we often refer to as your minimum viable sales plan. Today, we're talking about your minimum viable financial plan, but really you also need to start thinking about your minimum viable sales and marketing plan. And my colleague, Colin McQuinney, who's my partner at Canada Startup, he's also the sales strategist with Volition Advisors. He's going to be speaking to this for about an hour and a half early in December. And so the two dovetail well together. And if this is of critical interest to you, I'd encourage you to join in to that presentation as well. So that's point number 4 of the 7-point questionnaire. Now we're going to switch gears again, and we're going to talk about, we've talked about, okay, I understand how to get to a fixed price point per customer. I'm starting to understand now what it takes to build out a sales engine. But really now you need to step back and sort of think, okay, well, I need to sort of forecast this over time. And I need to kind of understand what are the goals the financial goals, the revenue goals, and the sales targets that I should be shooting for over the next 12, 24, 36 months. And what I always tell early stage entrepreneurs is, you know what? Start with break even. Just do a back of the envelope calculation to figure out if I've got a rough idea of my price point and I got a rough idea of the gross margin I'm going to make off a single transaction. And I've investigated a little bit on what my month-to-month fixed operating costs are, then what is the minimum volume of activity that I need to generate just to survive and stay afloat? And this is absolutely critical for you as an early stage entrepreneur and founder. It's also, surprisingly enough, for the more sophisticated, experienced angel investors out there, it's really important to them as well. There's a misnomer, there's a misperception out there that early stage investors want to see this incredible hockey stick where you're achieving remarkable growth within a matter of 3-5 years and you're this great unicorn story. The reality is truly seasoned investors and truly seasoned serial entrepreneurs know that that is a very rare situation. Unicorns truly are a mythical creature that only shows up once in a blue moon. Usually your early years, represent a bit of an up and down and a bit of an up and down. And what angel investors really want to understand are kind of three things. Do you have those fundamental unit economics that speak to the potential for real profit transaction by transaction? Number two, do you have a systematic sales engine that Colin is going to speak to on December 8th? Do you have evidence that you are putting the right resources in place and the right personnel to drive a systematic sales engine that is going to find those customers over and over and over again in a predictable fashion? If those two pieces are in place, intuitively you can assume that gradually over time, you will start to achieve growth. But the critical threshold that everyone wants to see you get to is that break-even cash flow positive time frame. And the reason why that's essential is because, first off, it's your do or die. At the point that you hit break-even, you are truly self-sustaining. And it means a couple things. First off, it means that you can actually have a decent night's sleep knowing that everybody on your team is going to get paid at the end of the month and the end of the year. But secondly, and most importantly, you are no longer dependent on external funding. So you no longer necessarily need to go to investors or a financial institution. You probably will to look for additional funding in order to potentially accelerate your growth or maybe underwrite the next generation of your product innovation. But now it becomes a choice. And you can be much more strategic about the timing of when you want to do that and how much money you want to take and under what terms. So break even is absolutely critical for you. And I would encourage you, if you're in the early days and you're doing that back of the envelope calculation, just start with that to begin with. And then we can talk about what things might look like in years 2, 3, 4. Now, I'm going to quickly run through some examples just to give you an idea of what that math quite often looks like. And it can be very different, but it can also be really informative, again, as it relates to the sales model you need to back up this financial model. In the case of self-serve SaaS, like MailChimp, I'm going to tell you, and I'm just estimating these numbers. This is sort of a hypothetical I'm running you through, but I've modeled enough software companies to know that earlier stage software companies with a minimum viable product could easily see a break-even threshold of about 1.75 million in annual recurring revenue. Well, I'm also going to say in the case of MailChimp, early on, they were primarily targeting small to mid-sized customers, and maybe they were selling 3 licenses per company or per client. And that amounted to only about, 500 to 550 probably in terms of annual recurring revenue per customer. Well, of course, what that then tells you right away is they would need, or this hypothetical company would need over 3,000 customers that they're maintaining and retaining over time just to be self-sustaining and maintain that break-even threshold. Well, what I can tell you, and again, Colin will get into this a little bit more on December 8th, but when you're looking at that kind of a number and you're an early stage startup, you're going to realize very quickly that what you need to build towards is an automated digital marketing engine, because to build out a human-centric sales team to try to close 500 deals is not an economically viable or efficient way to reach that target of 1.75 million. So just doing this basic back of the envelope calculation immediately begins to inform you not only what your break-even threshold looks like, but it would then inform your sales strategist in the form of, say, Colin McQuinney, my partner. He'd say, okay, well, based on what I'm seeing here, we really need to drive towards this automated digital marketing engine. Now, I'll give you another example, though, going back to Procore, that more sophisticated transactional SaaS for the construction management industry. Very different story. Let's assume hypothetically that their break-even threshold was about the same. But in this particular case, and I've done a little bit of work in the world of construction management software, I can tell you that the deals that are negotiated and the volume of users on a single client contract is usually much higher. In order for these solutions to make any kind of sense for a general contractor, they usually need to get anywhere between 30, 50, and even 100 users simultaneously using this platform for a single project, like the construction of, say, a 30-story high-rise. And as a result, you've got a lot more stakeholders involved. The tool tends to be a little bit more complicated. There's a lot more training required. And again, there's a much bigger headcount in terms of a single customer contract. As a result, you're justified to charging a much higher annual licensing fee. And I'm going to estimate this to be about $25,000. Well, again, now what that's actually telling you, not only from a money model perspective, but from a sales model perspective, it's going to tell you a couple of things. In this case, it's going to tell you, well, the good news is I only need to crank out 70 sales, not 3,250 sales. So that, seems like a bit less of a burden. However, it's a much more complicated product to sell. Multiple users, your needs assessment during your due diligence phone calls is going to be significantly higher. So as a result, unlike a company like MailChimp, you probably are going to need to be designing a human-centric sales team, and you're probably going to be up against much longer sales cycles. I'm going to say for a product like this, it could be anywhere between 3 and even 6 months ultimately to get a signed agreement. Whereas with MailChimp, I'm going to estimate that a lot of decisions are made with small to mid-sized companies within a matter of days or maybe a week. They make a decision between MailChimp and another provider and put their credit card down. So I'm hoping what I'm illustrating here is, we haven't even gotten into some sort of a very complex pro forma or a 10 or 12 tab Excel spreadsheet, which is often what an angel investor needs to look at further down the road during due diligence. You as an early stage entrepreneur, can really crank out some pretty simple math to begin to inform you right away as what it is to your critical thresholds, your break-even milestone, but also the sales engine that you may need to put behind all this. I'm going to give you 2 more examples quickly. My partner and I helped a young lady on the island with her money model and sales model around the sale of an infant item. It was an accessory. It was sort of a teething soother of a type. So not quite this, but I'm going to tell you roughly speaking. I'm fudging the numbers a little, but her break-even threshold looked like about $600,000 in annual recurring revenue. She was a boutique operation with a couple of assistants and managing a factory overseas. But here's the trick. While her break-even threshold was quite low, the reality is she was only walking away with gross profit of about $3, let's say, per unit. Well, very quickly, we came to discover, look, just to sustain yourself, you need to find 200,000 buyers every year. And these need to be new buyers because this isn't really a situation where you have a recurring sales opportunity. And so in this case, we discovered very quickly, or came to the conclusion very quickly, which is often the case with retail situations, is that you're very dependent on sourcing channel partner distribution and relying heavily on pre-established, what we call big box brands that drive this kind of product and volume, and where people are already trained to shop at certain locations, which saves you the time and expense of building out your own brand. And so in her particular case, she was speaking to operators and successfully got into operators like Walmart and London Drugs and others. But again, it's these numbers just seeing that 200,000 figure immediately kind of triggers in your imagination, okay, this is probably not something I can do on my own. So strategically, who can I partner with to help drive this bottom line? And my last example, again, we worked with a tech manufacturer. And again, this is a situation, very sophisticated technology, physical product, factory operations that needed to be managed. The break-even threshold was quite a bit higher, 2.5 million, we'll just estimate as a hypothetical. They were making reasonable gross margin, gross profit of 4,000 against a $7,500 ticket price. In this particular case, they needed to sell 625 units in order to maintain sort of a self-sustaining level of operation. But this was a very sophisticated piece of technology in a niche market. And once again, they were reliant on a direct sales team, but they also started working with channel partners as well, who already had a trusted relationship in the markets they were trying to pursue. So I'm kind of walking you through 4 very rapid fire examples where it's remarkable how just a very quick break-even calculation starts to reveal some numbers that immediately help you to appreciate what your operating model and your sales model is going to look like. And again, I would encourage you to join Colin McQuinney on December 8th, because he'll then very quickly start to steer into, well, how do I start engineering a sales model to help support that discovery? A couple of other points I'm going to make. Once you've run your break-even calculation, the next thing you kind of want to do is a quick viability check against that total accessible market that might be available to you in which you want to sell. And I'm going to use Procore as that example. You know, we said, look, just to achieve break-even, we need to close 70 deals. But what does that look like relative to the total size of the market? And I did some quick research. And again, what I'm encouraging you, this doesn't necessarily take weeks or months of research. I mean, in a matter of 15 minutes, I did a quick Google survey on a couple of industry directories and determined, you know, there's roughly 6,500 leading contractors out there in North America, about 27,000 contractors in total. Well, what that's telling me is that I really only need to penetrate about 1%, 1.25% of leading contractors in order to be self-sustaining. Or as little as 0.25% of the total addressable market in North America. Well, you know, you're going to want to step back and you're going to want to ask yourself, you know, is that a percentage that seems daunting? Does it scare me? Or does that actually seem like a fairly attainable, realistic percentage? And in this particular case, I'm going to say, if you have the right kind of sales engine behind you, that this would be an attainable target. If you had discovered it was closer to 20%, that's again where you might step back and say, okay, the alarm bells are going off, the red flags are going up. I need to kind of go back through that entire exercise that I've gone through and determine, is there anything that I can change to make this a little bit more viable? Last thing I'm going to say on this subject as it relates to just setting goals and growth targets. Once you've got your head wrapped around that break-even threshold, then absolutely you need to begin to think about, well, what are the growth mechanisms that will enable me to scale and enable me to achieve the kind of profit that I want to secure in terms of my own return on investment and effort, as well as what I'll likely need to put in front of an investor to entice them to cut me a check. And this is just a quick list. And there's many other strategies and growth mechanisms you could pursue. But again, the big one often, very quickly, you're going to ask yourself in one way or another, are there strategic partners or channel distribution strategies I can pursue? Are there different types of exclusivity that I can get into? Is there an exclusive that I can set up with the channel partner that has direct access to a market that's important to me? Could I get into a situation where I could negotiate an exclusive territory right, working with a distribution partner? Or perhaps once I start onboarding customers, I mean, am I in a space and a place where I might actually be able to negotiate an exclusive provider agreement with them to say, hey, I want to be your exclusive provider for the next 3, 4, 5 years. As a result, I might negotiate a bit more of a friendly price and terms of engagement. Government contracts are another example, notoriously difficult to sell into. But if you believe you have a compelling way to get into government, often notoriously to sell into, but then once you're involved, in many cases, you can be embedded, and that can lead to sort of a long-term horizon. Of course, patent protection is critical and can allow for an extended time frame to sell. So these are just any number of strategies, but you want to start thinking about what that might look like in terms of your growth engine. So now I'm going to need a couple more minutes than an hour, but we are getting close to the end. We've gone again through your business model informs you how you're likely to charge. We've talked a little bit about, okay, what do I need to understand about my profit potential for a single customer? How do I start thinking about extending the lifetime value of that single customer and generating recurring revenue in one way or another for every single customer I land? Do I have a repeatable sales engine behind what it is I'm doing? And do I understand what are some of my first essential milestones and goals that I need to achieve financially in order to survive and ultimately succeed? The next topic I'm going to suggest is when you start thinking about growth, you also need to flip gears a little bit and think about, well, as I grow, I'm likely to run into some capacity constraints as well. And I need to understand when and where I may need to change and expand my operating model or my sales model in order to accommodate that growth. And I often refer to Chris Hadfield, the famous Canadian astronaut, and chapter 6 of his book, Astronaut's Guide to Life, which is an absolutely fantastic read if you're an investor. The mindset lends very well to the world we all live in as entrepreneurs. And in chapter 6, he kind of jokingly makes a quip about while he's floating out there in the stratosphere, he's often asking himself, what's the next thing that's going to kill him? And it's a tongue-in-cheek kind of way of saying that always he needs to be mindful of the risks and the potential liabilities that are lying ahead in the near and even distant future so that he can prepare well in advance and mitigate and ultimately deter those risks from happening, offset those risks. So it's all about having an active state of thinking and tracking and mitigating as you grow over time and as you revisit your money model, which will evolve over time. And so we encourage you, once you've sort of laid down that foundation money model, is to begin to do a bit of what we refer to as sensitivity analysis and conduct some what if scenarios and say, well, look, what if my sales do suddenly double? I mean, that's a fantastic scenario, but am I capable of handling that? And what could that do to my operation? Is my team big enough? Am I manufacturing in high enough volume? And if I'm not, can my suppliers provide me raw material in greater volume at a speed and at a price point that makes sense to me? Alternatively, as I mentioned earlier, what if a critical component to what it is I'm manufacturing suddenly doubles in price because there's a real lack in the market, like lithium? Or, of course, the big one we're all struggling with this year, what if COVID suddenly shows up? What is that going to do to my customer base, my cost structure, my capacity, and my cash position? So once you've kind of got a sense about your money model, it's not a one and done situation. You're in a constant state of revisiting and reevaluating how you may grow and how you may need to model things out differently over time in order to maintain, not only maintain, but grow and build your profit. And so you'll get into questions like, well, when is it the right time to increase production? And as I increase production, what kind of additional economies of scale and efficiencies can I realize? When are the critical thresholds in which I should go back to my raw material providers and start negotiating volume and discount? When will it be time to expand my facility? Do I know precisely what volume of production gets me to a point where I can no longer work with my existing facility and I need to grow it or expand my own if I happen to have built out my own facility? When do I grow staff over time? These are sort of the critical questions to ask so you can start to understand what your growth levers are, what your vulnerabilities could be. And as soon as you understand those levers and vulnerabilities, well in advance, you can start thinking about how you can mitigate risks if certain scenarios start to show up on the horizon. Last point I'm going to make is as it relates to your cash requirements. Again, we've gone through the step-by-step process of getting familiar with your money model, understanding how and what it takes to set goals, and slowly set out those initial milestones, starting with break even. We talked about the fact that once you lay down a scenario, you want to then evaluate how it could vary. But ultimately, many of you are probably at a point where you need to raise some money, whether it's through government grant, debt financing, or private equity. And so the question is, well, how much money do you need to raise? And again, I usually say, look, begin by going back to that break-even milestone. and ask yourself, well, what is it going to take just to fund to this point? And again, you've confirmed your target sales volume. You've confirmed your target revenue. So what is the amount of money you need to raise to get you not only to have a fully developed innovation that's now commercialized and ready to sell, but also enough additional cash in the bank to establish the runway you need to reach that cash flow positive break-even threshold. And I'm going to say, I know it's a little bit tricky because ultimately nobody has a crystal ball, and early stage investors understand that just as much as anybody else does. But what you do want to be able to do is, with confidence, model out a number of different scenarios. And usually investors like to see a worst case, a moderate, and then more aggressive best case scenario. And the way I look at this, a lot of people are like, yeah, but how do I pick those scenarios? And one way I'd encourage you to do that is say, well, look, if break even is that threshold, then one way of looking at it is saying, well, let me run different scenarios where break even happens sooner or later. So if I'm estimating that I might reach break even after, say, 18 months, what does it look like if you actually hit break even after 12 months? And then how quickly would you run into capacity constraints? Or on the flip side, what if it's maybe a less promising scenario? What does happen if you need a longer runway because break even sort of at the 24 or 36-month scenario? And usually you want to err on the side of conservative, and you might say, well, look, I feel confident based on the client base I already have and based on my early stage customer discovery and some initial market feedback. I'm confident I can hit break even after 18 months, but maybe I should model this out for 24 months and ensure I have some additional cash in the bank to carry me and to mitigate that potential risk over time. Now, I'm speaking in hypotheticals. There's a point at which this transitions and you need to get into very real numbers in order to understand exactly what this looks like. What I'm trying to do today is just, again, walk you through step by step and sequentially the order of questions you should be asking yourself in order to get there. And these last questions around pro forma development, around cash flow analysis, break-even analysis, and the amount of money ultimately that you need to raise in order to try to get this program off the ground. It does ultimately require a pro forma. And that pro forma is usually a fairly comprehensive multi-tab spreadsheet that's out there. And you're incorporating a number of different components that go into that spreadsheet that help you to identify, again, your gross margins and unit economics on a single sale, your monthly sales targets over time, your operating budget. And with that model, once it's built out, it'll help you to model different growth scenarios, really confirm down to the individual sale what break even, and down to sort of the month what and when break even is going to look like, and your cash flow. But what I want to encourage the majority of you to understand is that will need to come. But really right now it's about, can you just rough out in general terms what your overall money model is going to look like? And start with that cocktail napkin exercise to begin with, then move into the pro forma. And I see a lot of people jump straight into the pro forma before they've just thought through the fundamentals. And as a result, their pro forma tends to be poorly designed. And ultimately, they kind of miss the critical milestones, and they miss sort of the landmarks that it is that they're trying to ultimately evaluate using a more sophisticated tool like a pro forma. Last thing I'm going to say, and thanks for your patience. I know I've taken a few extra minutes, but we're going to jump into Q&A after this. You're still probably going to ask yourself, well, yeah, but what about investors? And what I'm going to say is, first and foremost, you should be doing this money modeling exercise just for your own sake as founder, entrepreneur, and CEO, because these are all the critical questions you need to ask yourself. But what I'm also going to tell you is that I assure you, when you begin to speak to investors, or in many instances, if it's a government agency offering a grant, they're going to still want to see a package, not unlike what an investor looks at. And similarly, if it's the BDC or a private banking institution, they're all going to want to be asking similar questions. And what I can assure you from my experience, and again, this is sort of after being directly and indirectly involved in closer to $9 million in raise, is that ultimately investors are going to end up asking the exact same questions of you. Different investors may ask in different orders, in a different order. They may not certainly all come out those questions in that first 15 or 30-minute pitch that you may do an investor. But I can assure you that over time, as an investor gets excited about what it is you're doing, and they start setting up that second and third appointment with their analysts to begin to do a deep dive due diligence on all the different aspects of your operations. When it comes to your financial model, your money model, and what I call your MVFP, they will eventually get into all of these questions. They'll start to ask you, well, what is your price point and why did you set it the way you have? And what's the competition doing right now? And have you sold this a few times enough to know that your customer feels it's an acceptable price? You know, what are the gross margins? What are your unit economics? Is this a healthy margin? And then they're going to, certainly ask you if you've only been, commercial for even 12 months. They're going to say, look, I know we don't have a crystal ball here, but tell me a little about your sales engine. Tell me what you're doing to extend the life of customer, and then walk me through systematically what that sales engine is that's starting to grow your business in bulk. All of these questions in one way or another are going to come up. Ultimately, a more sophisticated investor at the time of due diligence is going to be talking about this kind of stuff. And so this is your master checklist. This is the checklist I encourage you to use when you're evaluating your business. And it's certainly the checklist ultimately that the investor is going to turn to one way or the other at some point in time. And on that note, I want to thank you. I hope that was helpful. I'm just going to switch gears here and start looking. I saw one question show up in the Q&A. Let me just double check. Cash requirements. I know Alan had a question about cash requirements, and let me get into the chat feed as well. Okay. Okay, thanks, Karen, for keeping an eye out for questions. So there was one question around cash requirements that came up, and I think it was Alan who posted it. Oh, let's see if there's a clarification on that again. Oh, did I do a misspelling of cash requirements? Sorry about that. There's always one. There's always one in every presentation. Thanks for spotting that. I'll be looking for that the next time. Absolutely. Absolutely. Any other questions where I can help you in any way with this? And by the way, you know what? While you're formulating questions, something else I'll share with you. I'd really encourage, I've been talking a little bit about Colin McQuinney's presentation on December 8th. Around, how do you actually reverse engineer and design a sales engine? But the other piece is on November 24th at 12. My other colleague from Volition Advisors, Mira, is going to be delivering a presentation on marketing and metrics, which really zeroes in on how an early stage startup goes about designing its initial digital marketing engine and engages in that early exercise of brand development, digital and social media marketing, depending on the space you're in. So between those two, November 24th for Mira and then December 8th for Colin on the sales side. I'd really encourage you to join both. I think you'll find that after seeing this, those pieces will sort of help to come together for you. I was thinking you might want to explain gross margin. Gotcha. There was a question here about gross margin. And again, I'll just go back to that slide. Let me see if I'm still sharing the screen. See if I can just find it here under unit economics. Here we go. So hopefully you can see that screen. So yeah, for those of you who are newer to the whole costing exercise of a business, costs usually fall into two categories: fixed costs and then what we call variable or direct costs of sale. And fixed costs are basically, what are those bills you need to pay month after month, no matter whether you're shop store is open or not. And usually those are things like rent, the power bill, without a doubt, salaries and wages for your permanent or fixed employees, your telecommunication bill, all of those kind of fees. If you're, I'm actually modeling out a pro forma for a client right now who has a delivery truck, and there's a monthly lease associated with the delivery truck that's being rented. So those are examples again of fixed costs. But then there are the direct costs of sale, and those are costs that you only spend as you sell each and every unit. And in the case of the drone that I use in this example, the direct costs of sale for that one drone include all the material components. If you don't sell the drone, you're not spending money on those material components. Sometimes there's a bit of labor associated with the assembly of that one unit, and so you might include just the cost of labor if it was a number of hours. And there might be commission, the commission that you'd give a sales rep for the sale of that one unit. If you sold that unit for, say, $10,000 and the sales rep received a 5% commission on that $10,000 sale, then that $500 would be a direct variable cost of sale for that one $10,000 purchase. Your gross profit is just looking at the total price of $10,000 less, let's say, $500 in commission, and let's say another $4,000 in material components and labor. So the costs I've just outlined were $4,000 in material components and labor, another $500 for commission. That's $4,500. The price was $10,000. So your gross profit is, you're left with $5,500, which is your gross profit and cash that you can then start to apply against your fixed costs, like your rent or the lease on the truck or salaries. And ideally what happens, of course, is when you start selling in volume, you're going to generate enough gross profit that it more than covers your fixed costs, and now you truly are making a net profit as a company. So I hope that helped answer the question a little bit. Let's see now. And there was a question about missing earlier parts of the presentation for those of you who may have showed up a little bit later. Quite all right. I know Karen at CAST, I believe, is recording this presentation. I'm going to hope and assume it is posted for you at some point. Absolutely. I'm bouncing back and forth between chat and Q&A here. Let's see if there's any other questions. There you go. And Karen, feel free, if you think there's any other areas, you of course ultimately have a pretty good sense of who you have in your community and potentially who's online. So depending on who's out there, if there's a business model, for example, that I may not have spoken to, or if there was some terminology that maybe requires a bit more clarification, like gross profit, gross margin, let me know if there's anything else I can speak to. All good. 2 questions in Q&A. Oh, let me take a look. Okay, I'm seeing a business model we have is a mix of a marketplace and a B2B SaaS. Okay, so growth depends greatly on user acquisition. How can we project break-even point when there are a lot of factors? It depends on. That's a fantastic question. And I'm not going to lie, you're definitely in one of the more complicated business models to try to model out. I'm gonna begin by saying the first thing I look at when it comes to marketplace model is I typically call them the double-headed dragon, because a marketplace model usually has a minimum of 2 audiences and sometimes more, but let's just start with 2 audiences to begin with. One of the first things you want to ask yourself is, usually, and sometimes it's difficult, but usually there's ultimately what we call a supply side and a buy side. So in the case of Airbnb, I mean, ultimately the supply side is the condos. And then the buy side are people traveling around looking for affordable accommodation as they travel the world. With Uber, it's ultimately people with vehicles who are willing to give others a drive, or in the case of StubHub, it's the people with the tickets looking to resell event tickets to somebody else. So one of the first things you want to do when you're modeling all of this out, before you even get into the break-even calculation, is to determine, well, what is my supply side? And what is the critical mass? It's essentially inventory. So what is the critical amount of initial inventory that I need to put in place as a marketplace before I'm even going to entice people to come and shop on my platform? And I mean, it's not unlike opening a bookstore. You know, if you open a bookstore with one book on the shelf, a world atlas and the Bible, you're going to have a couple buyers, but that's it. I mean, usually you need tens of thousands of titles in order to offer the kind of variety that's going to get people excited. So it's a question about critical mass. And so that then gets into a discussion about how are you building that critical mass, over what time, and what is that going to cost you? And again, without knowing precisely what you're doing, usually building up that critical mass requires either a B2B sales effort or a digital marketing effort, or both. And it usually takes time. So that's a critical cost component that then helps you, it gets you towards understanding what break even looks like. Once you understand the cost to get the supply side up and running, then what you're doing is you're saying, okay, I now know how much that's already costing me. And if you have a particular fee structure associated with the transaction, you know, you're going to start to understand, okay, well, now I need to drive at least a minimum amount of volume to the marketplace in order to cover the costs it took to get the supply built up. And that also is going to require a bit of a marketing effort as well, which you need to sort of model into your overall cost structure. The way I look at it, quite honestly, is going back to the bookstore scenario, is that whenever you're opening up a retail store, part of your upfront costs, which is a financial risk, is you need to buy inventory in order to fill the shelves. And with a marketplace model, that's essentially what you're doing. You're not buying a large quantity of books as inventory, but you're basically spending money to get that critical mass of the supply side up and running. And it's very much the same exercise. And once you understand the time and the cost it takes to do that, that is a very critical piece of the cost structure, which then helps you to sort out the break even. I hope that's helpful. It's the marketplace model, without a doubt, is one of the trickier ones. And certainly, I'll go back to my closing slide where there's my email address. And so you're more than welcome to reach out to me afterwards if you have any more questions, because like all business models, and especially marketplace models, they are nuanced. So I've given you some general advice, but that might not be adequate enough for what you're trying to figure out. Another question I see here: any good tips to estimate manufacturing costs without having to get quotes? Yeah, that's a pretty big, broad question. I mean, the wonderful thing about Google and YouTube as well, which is a pretty potent search engine in and of itself. It's amazing what people actually put up in the form of video rather than sort of text articles. But the great thing about Google is, if you read, depending on the components you're looking for, I mean, I guess ultimately the question is, what are the components that are required to manufacture your product? Try to Google in as many different ways what the availability and cost of those components are. Also try to Google it's amazing what people post in terms of information on the average per unit cost as it relates to manufacturing in a factory operation, wherever that factory may be deployed. Another tip, actually, recently I was involved in a project where somebody used Alibaba. I think it was Alibaba. If you go to Alibaba, people are suppliers of materials are posting all the time information on what their costs are in volume, and they actually introduce staggered prices. I was in a situation where somebody was trying to do custom t-shirts. It was very simple, But they were looking at different design t-shirts, different quality of cotton and material. And they went on Alibaba, and there were these providers overseas in different parts of Asia that had actually posted an incredible volume of information on different qualities of shirts and how much it would cost in bulk at different level for 100 shirts, 500, 1,000, 5,000. And it was enough to enable this client of mine at least to kind of estimate roughly what they were getting into. But without a doubt, beyond that, the reality is there is a point at which you, depending on where you're manufacturing and what the components are, there is a point at which you kind of need to roll up your sleeves and start to directly engage raw material providers and manufacturers if you're reliant on a facility, a factory, or assembly operation, and start getting kind of per unit estimates. I hope that's helpful. Without a doubt, there are some business models, in particular manufacturing being one, where there's definitely a lot of research that's required, so you can hone in on some critical data. Let's see, I'm flipping to answers. Okay, and back to the chat, bouncing back and forth here. Okay. I'll wait a couple more minutes, but if not, any more questions, then again, first off, thanks all of you for attending. I hope this was helpful for you and provided some good content and information. As Karen has wonderfully offered, I think this is being recorded, and I know I had to move fairly quickly through a lot of the material, so hopefully you'll have a chance to go back and look over it a second time. But for those of you who may have a bit more of a detailed or nuanced question as it relates to your particular business, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I've got an email up on the screen here, chris@canadastartup.com, and we'll be happy to try to elaborate on some of the key points that I shared with you today. And I'm just going through Q&A one last time to see if there's any other questions. But I don't think I do see any. Karen, you let me know if there's anything else that I can share.
No, Chris, honestly, you covered so much goodness, and thank you so much for your presentation and for all your insight and advice. It's amazing. So yeah, everyone, again, just get in touch with Chris if you have any more questions, or you can email me as well, and I will send out the recording. All right, thank you so much, everyone.
And thank you, Karen, again for the opportunity to speak. And as I mentioned one last time, please do feel free to chime in with Mira on the 24th and Colin on the 8th, because I think you'll find again that the three presentations together really are kind of an integrated approach to understanding how to model your whole business. So hopefully it'll be helpful. Yeah.
Totally. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Chris, and thanks so much, everyone. I hope you have a great day.
Have a great day, everybody. Thank you.